up with the infrastructure and financing demands of this type of exponential demand growth would be challenging in any system, but it's particularly challenging given the prevalence of power and fuel subsidies in the Middle East that put a larger and larger burden on the state. This is all in the context of global trends related to climate change and energy transition that many of our watchers and participators are very familiar with. But in the Middle East, this is namely related to the expectation, despite differing forecasts about timeline and scale, that demand for fossil fuels will eventually plateau and then decrease, challenging the fiscal model and political economy of countries in the region, particularly fossil fuel exporters. So in this context, we're focusing today on two aspects of the energy transition that are distinct but very closely linked, namely the sort of political level decisions that are shaping overall political economies of states in the region. You can think of the types of policies laid out in countries' vision plans, for instance, that have gotten a lot of attention, but broadly the policies that are determining economic diversification trajectories in the region. And then the other aspect that we're focusing on is the more technical, but still certainly very political challenge of planning for and investing in adequate grid infrastructure and storage to accommodate growing renewables adoption in the Middle East. So to talk about these aspects today, we have Dr. Yunus Abuyub, who is a visiting senior research fellow with the Department of Political Science at the University of New England, who has worked for the United Nations on issues of peace building, conflict resolution, and sustainable development. So he has a lot of expertise on the issues that we're discussing today, and is the author of numerous academic articles and edited books. He holds a PhD in political sociology, and we're very glad to have him here with us today. Jessica Obeid is a founder and partner at New Energy Consult in Dubai, as well as a non-resident scholar with the Middle East Institute. And today she'll draw on her over 15 years of experience in engineering, think tanks, and consulting across Europe, Middle East, and Africa, where she advises on the development of sustainable energy systems to inform her comments today. She has degrees in political science as well as electrical engineering. So she has both the technical and social science background that she'll be bringing to our discussion today. Sadly, we won't be joined by Lama Kiasa, who had a last-minute conflict. However, you can read chapters authored by both of our panelists today, as well as Lama and a number of other authors in MEI's recently, let's see if we'll go through the blur background, recently published edited volume, Energy Transition in the Middle East, co-edited by myself and MEI's Energy and Economics Program Director Emeritus, Dr. Karen Young. Thank you again for joining us in the audience today. We look forward to engaging with your questions later in the discussion. And now I will turn to our panelists. Yunus, first of all, I'll go to you to sort of start off with a broad question of what does the energy transition mean for the political economy of Middle Eastern countries? How does this differ for importers and exporters? Because obviously there's a lot of diversity in the region. But if you could give us an overall picture to start off the discussion.
Well, thank you. Thank you for organizing this event, and good morning to all of you. I believe that the energy transition will definitely and significantly impact the political economies of Middle East and North African countries. Of course, this will have different implications for oil and gas importers versus exporters. For the first category, I think the energy exporters in the region will be impacted in the sense that there will be a reduced reliance. Countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and others are more and more now looking to diversify their economies away from a dependence on hydrocarbon revenue. They realize the shift at the global level. So the transition will offer an opportunity to invest in new industries, and maybe, if done in the right way and early enough, they could become also leaders in clean energy sectors like hydrogen and others. There's also the dimension of economic security. A rapid decline in oil demand could definitely hurt these economies. So they will need to measure their transition to ensure that there's continued revenue streams while building a new economic engines. And then there is also a geopolitical dimension or shift. The role of these countries as major energy suppliers might change. It will be affected. But then this also offers new opportunities for them. They could become crucial players in the future energy landscape by exporting new types of energies, and also that way could help them maintain their geopolitical clout. Now, regarding the other category, hydrocarbon importers, countries in the region like Morocco, Jordan, and others will spend less, or rather a significant less amount on fossil fuel imports, which is a major share of their budget and spending every year. So transitioning to renewables can lower their energy import bills and improve energy security. It will also impact the infrastructure, investment infrastructure. Shifting to these new type of energies will require investment in new infrastructure like solar, wind farms, creating jobs and boosting local economies. We already see this, by the way, in countries like Morocco. And also, this affordable and reliable energy in the future could be an essential component in maintaining social stability. Many of these countries that are developing, or some of them are actually least developed countries, suffer from issues of social and political stability because of economic stress. So they will need to ensure a smooth transition that does not disrupt energy access of their citizens. Overall, I think we're looking towards a new type of transition. To make it just and equitable, we'll need sound policies to maintain stability in that transition period. And also, I think regional cooperation is a must for these countries to ensure that there is no hiccups in this transition. I believe in the current economic transitions, diversification is becoming a necessity. It's not a policy option for countries that are producing oil and gas. The economic structure is unsustainable. These countries have suffered at times from negative effects of the fluctuation in international oil policies, and they need to adjust quickly to the technological shift and the new, I would call it the fourth industrial revolution. This economic diversification is a process that entails a broad societal process, which transfers a country from a single source of income, oil and gas in this case, to a society that relies on multiple sources of income that generated across primary, secondary, and tertiary field, where a large section of the population, including public and private enterprise, could participate in this development process. Last but not least, I would say that this economic diversification carries with it a political dimension. It will mean a deep power implications for ruling elites. While they realize that reforms are needed to prepare for the transition, I think that there are countries who try as much as possible to delay that. So channeling economic rents through expanded public services, government employment, exclusive business contracts for decades has weakened efforts to develop a truly competitive and dynamic private sector that is capable of generating sustainable development and growth for the future. So any policy effort to reduce this rent-seeking behavior would require addressing the constraints of the governance social contract and actually reviewing the whole social contract and introducing new channels. Because once natural resources rents runs out, these countries will be facing precarious positions of having to maintain what I would call, quote unquote, I mean, some sort of a dead weight of channels that can no longer serve their purpose. So all told, I would say that the energy transition presents both challenges and opportunities for the many countries in terms of political economy. So by embracing this change and working together for more integration in the region, can navigate this transition and build, hopefully, a more sustainable future for their citizens.
Thank you. That's a great scene setter for our discussion. And Jessica, from your perspective, this energy transition and energy diversification that Yunus talks about is already ongoing. What's your perspective on the status of the energy transition and adoption of clean energy in the Middle East?
Yes, to build on what was discussed and what Yunus has mentioned on the political economy, these are also major drivers for the energy transition in the MENA region. So we see that all governments, regardless if they're net energy exporters or importers, do have a major driver in transitioning to low carbon energy systems and implementing low carbon technology, and that's the reduction of fossil fuel for domestic energy systems. And so we see that net energy exporters want to reduce oil and gas demand for domestic market to free oil and gas for exports, and also importers, as Yunus has mentioned, want to reduce their import bills. So that's a major driver, and we're seeing that this has galvanized more traction and commitment towards energy diversification, but especially renewable energy across the different MENA states. However, the key factor in moving forward is, of course, access to finance. And here's the distinction between oil and gas producers, importers, and also conflict states, because their ability to access finance is quite different. And the ability for governments to invest in this energy transition on low carbon technologies is quite different. So we see that Gulf states, for example, can afford and do have the capacity to invest in low carbon technologies, whereas others are struggling. Political instability is a major hindrance for any kind of investment, of course. But when we look into the investments, we see that a lot of it is going into renewable energy. The bulk of it is in renewable energy. So it's in power generation specifically, and it's emphasizing power generation, whereas other energy systems are still lagging behind, especially on the transport, building industries. And when we look into the power sector, we're also seeing that the emphasis of investments and focus of diversification is still on the power generation side. So we're seeing less investments and less focus on the distribution and the transmission side, on the grid, particularly on the grid investments. So that's going to be also, it's going to create bottlenecks moving forward. And some of the key challenges that I'm going to mention now are just also applicable to all the energy transition, and that we're still witnessing an excessive sustainable growth in energy demand in the MENA market. So for example, the electricity demand growth rate has been averaging 7 to 8% annually across the different countries. Of course, there are discrepancies between countries, but on average, it's 7 to 8% annually, compared to a global average of 5%. In the power sector, this has driven to a race to add power generation capacity, not only in renewable energy, but also in thermal capacity. So we're seeing a lot of thermal power plants also being built, and mostly in gas. So we're also seeing a more shift towards gas as fuel for power generation. And natural gas is now the dominant source of fuel for power generation. And another bottleneck is that we have subsidies in the energy systems, which create bottlenecks and challenges for attracting investments. So I'm gonna leave it here, because we can go on forever on what's
Yes,
happening.
I do want to follow up on one thing that you mentioned. You highlighted grid investment in particular as a constraint on expanding low carbon technology adoption, but and sort of an area where there's not as much focus. Can you talk about some of the reasons for this underinvestment and how they might be addressed?
Yeah, so to address this, I need to quickly go through the power sector market and the Middle Eastern countries in the MENA region, which are, so we have a single buyer model, which is the utility has kind of to purchase all the electricity being generated and distributed. And the other thing is that we have state-owned utilities, electricity utilities, and 60% of the state-owned utilities in the Middle East are vertically integrated, which means that a single utility, power generation, distribution, and transmission sectors. And so any investments in any kind of power generation has to come from the utility side, from the state side, eventually. So governments need to afford these investments first, or be able to attract investments, which is a key challenge, considering when we look into the political and socioeconomic situation of most Middle Eastern countries, then we see that the state doesn't have much capacity to invest in the power sector. And then, so they resort for private sector engagement. In this case, it would be independent power producers who would sign agreements. And so it's easier to attract investments into the power sectors through signing power purchase agreements with the private sector into production. Often these contracts do not include any upgrade or enhancement of any grid. And so we're left into all these bottlenecks, because to be able to integrate renewable energy into the energy systems and to the power systems, we're going to need upgraded, more efficient, more optimized, smarter grids. And we don't have that because the investments are so low. So for example, on average, the investments into the grid in MENA countries, that's on average, they range from 8 to 10% of all the investments in the power sector. So there have been more emphasis on generating power. There's less focus on how we're going to transmit this power. In the case of renewable energy, that's a huge challenge. First, because it means we're generating electricity that cannot be passed to the consumer. And second, that state-owned utilities, which are often state-owned, are going to pay for these contracts and for the electricity being generated without it necessarily being consumed on the distribution and user side. So because these power purchase agreements often, always, in the case of MENA countries, contain a take or pay clauses, which means that whether the government or the utility is using this electricity or not, they're taking this electricity, they're using it or not, they have to pay for it. So the curtailment on the grid side, because the grid cannot handle all this capacity, means that we're paying for the electricity that's being generated anyway.
Thank you. Eunice, you mentioned plans for economic diversification, and everything that Jessica said has kind of like hinged back to this economic model, but that will potentially be sort of evolving over the coming years. And states in the Middle East have had plans for economic diversification for years, and the context is always changing, from a world of anticipated peak oil supply, which now feels rather distant, to one now where the conversation is more around climate change and anticipated peak demand. In today's context, like what does economic diversification look like? What could it look like? And yeah, I'll look forward to hearing your comments.
Well, economic diversification implies basically the development of policies that are able to reduce the dependence of a particular country on a single industry or a single sector. In this case, it's oil and gas in terms of their contribution to the GDP, in terms of export earnings and government revenues. So decreasing dependence on hydrocarbons occurs by developing non-hydrocarbon economic sectors. It could be the sector of services, manufacturing, tourism, agriculture, in order for the country in question to become or to generate new sources of government revenues. I mean, we see this now in countries of the Middle East, and especially Saudi Arabia, with this new vision of developing tourism, developing other sectors, services to develop new channels and new revenue streams. As you said, this is not new. because the first phase of economic diversification or attempts at diversification began in the 70s by expanding the oil sector in the upstream and downstream industries, as well as the creation of oil-related industries such as petrochemicals, aluminium. So these countries tried to shift substantial proportions of investment from the extractive industries per se to more capital-intensive and energy-intensive industries like petrochemicals, fertilizers, steel, aluminium, because these sectors or these industries utilize the comparative advantage in the energy sector, as well as expanding industries that could benefit from low-cost energy, such as cement, construction, and building materials. And more recently, a new phase of diversification has been taking place in the form of investment in what I would call physical and human capital development, particularly in areas relating to schooling, educational infrastructure, health services. This diversification has gone beyond the energy sector and its related industries, with the intention of working towards the establishment and development of knowledge-based economy. We see that there are new economic visions in Oman, Saudi Arabia, with new development strategies that are concentrating more and more on export diversification, development of service industries, finance, aviation, media, education, sports, also real estate. Dubai is also it's a case in point that does not rely anymore on oil. These national visions focus on key pillars more these days: human development, social development, and environmental development. All of them in order to contribute at the global level to the achievement of Agenda 2030 with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. This being said, an assessment of the current national visions and development strategies in the hydrocarbon producing countries indicates still that the progress has not been achieved in real and effective economic diversifications, because the local economic cycles remain still dependent on oil and gas revenues, despite the existence of other sectors. For instance, there are numerous challenges to create knowledge economy in these countries, given the current condition of the educational system, low investment in research and development. It is around 1% compared from the GDP compared to a global average of 3%. And the political and governance aspect, with a restricted civil liberty and political freedom space that hinder the private sector from developing further. However, given the availability of capital and the move towards the creation of this knowledge-based economy, seems, in my opinion, the most sensible policy option for these countries to create a viable economy in the future. But this means, as I said earlier, that there are governance dimensions to it, and there are risks also associated with it. Let me now just touch slowly briefly on subsidies, because to develop new sectors, you need the state and the government to provide subsidies. Policymakers must look beyond an immediate impetus to cut budgets and focus instead on developing the necessary building blocks for a dynamic and sustainable post-hydrocarbon economy. For instance, direct financial subsidies, which can provide cash grants or tax breaks to companies in specific industries, which could be for manufacturers, tech startups, or renewable energy firms, depending, of course, on the goals for each country. They could offer also tax breaks, which they do actually on income, property, or imports, that can make it cheaper for companies to set up new sectors. And this is quite important for attracting FDIs. They can also subsidize training and research, which is still low. We can talk about infrastructure development, investing in infrastructure like transportation networks, communication systems, and special economic zones that can make region more attractive to businesses. And also, on the other side, on the demand side, the subsidies for consumers, subsidizing consumer purchases in new industries would enable these countries to create demand and encourage business growth. For instance, electric vehicle subsidies can boost the clean energy sector in these countries. In any case, I think for the subsidies, it is important that they are strategic. And they'll say at least they could focus on these three main pillars. They have to be targeted with industries that provide high growth potential. They should be temporary, so to help jumpstart new industries, but eventually they should be phased out, or else they will create another form of dependence and rent-seeking behavior that plagued these economies for years or decades, rather. And then they should be performance-based. They should tie as much as possible the subsidies to achieving specific benchmarks, such as new job creations and export growth. All told, I would say economic diversification remains a complex process, and subsidies are just one tool in the toolbox. So these countries to be successful in the post-hydrocarbon phase, the government should consider factors that are, or a policy that are holistic. Think about trade policies, regulations, and fostering, most of all, a new culture of innovation within their societies, which again, as I said earlier, would require a shift in the social contract and the governance paradigm.
Thank you for that. Jessica, one of the issues that relates to the grid transmission you were talking about is regional interconnections. And there are occasionally, news stories about regional interconnections and announcements and new investments. And I think there's a sense, a broad sense that regional interconnections could add value, but there are factors holding them back that I'll let you get into a little bit. Can you talk about both the factors holding them back and what the potential could be for greater interconnection between countries in the MENA region and beyond, and what it might take for states to get there?
I think that supergrids and regional integration is something that would de facto happen in the future. I don't have an answer for when this is going to happen, and that's because of several challenges I'm going to mention now. But we do have in the region 3 different interconnections. We have one in the Maghreb for North African countries, and we have the GCC Gulf countries, and we also have one for 8 countries that involves mostly Levant and Turkey countries. So we already have these grid interconnections. They're separated, they're not mostly connected to each other. And a key problematic is that they rarely operate, they're underutilized. Originally, these 3 grid interconnections were developed for different reasons. And North Africa, they wanted to also connect to Europe, and they are connected to Europe in different locations and different substations. And the others were to kind of create a cross-border electricity exchange market and provide more energy security and reduce the need for a reserve margin across different countries. But they're only operating in emergencies when there's, for example, in the Gulf interconnection, the GCC Interconnection Authority, it mostly operates when there is a blackout. For example, let's take an example, Kuwait. In July, there's an increase in temperature, record high temperatures reaching 51%. We have a blackout, then we're going to use that interconnection, for example. So they're operating at less than 5% annually, but this needs to be ramped up. And the reasons for this is, first, we'd have reduced reliance on thermal power because we'd add renewable energy. And we can add renewable energy a lot more when we have grid interconnections, because renewable energy and the bulk of renewable energy that we're deploying in MENA countries are solar and wind. So they're intermittent renewable energy sources. We have solar energy when the sun is available, wind when the wind is blowing. But so that intermittency and variability creates instability on the grid and different frequencies. So to stabilize this, a grid interconnected grid can work with this. It would also help countries reach their targets because no country can reach, for example, 100% renewable energy or net zero targets without this grid interconnections that would help use renewable energy capacity through other countries. It would also mean more efficient energy systems because now the countries that can afford that, for example, high-income countries, mostly Gulf, have to race to add power generation to meet the race in power demand. So that means keeping a lot of reserve margin available just for on standby, just for a few days in the year when we're going to need this. So this comes at a high cost and reduces efficiencies. So this is where also grid interconnections are very important. And on the long term, we hope we're going to be able to trade and have trade electricity and have an efficient electricity exchange market, not only in the Middle East, but also beyond, because all these grid interconnections, the three of them, countries connected to them, have always had goals to, for example, Egypt wants to connect in different places in Africa. It's already connected, but it's also not optimized. And addressing this, we know Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and so want to sell electricity for Iraq. There have been movements on this area in the past years. But in order to establish an efficient electricity exchange market, there are so many hurdles to be bypassed. One is political, one is investment, because we're always getting back to the investment angle that we need a lot of money to build this. And third is subsidies, which Yunus has also addressed. And the subsidies is not a matter of only subsidies on electricity, but also there's a challenge with all the cross subsidies because we have the fuel being subsidized, power generation, etc., which means that no country wants to pass this cheap electricity to another country. But reaching a cost of recovery is also challenging because of all the different cross subsidies, but also because of all the socioeconomic factors. But I think it's gonna happen. I think it's not straightforward, it's challenging, but it's bound to happen.
Well, thank you for that optimistic note. I just wanted to note for our audience that after the next round of questions, I will be taking questions from the Q&A box. So please drop any questions you have for our panelists into that Q&A box that you should be able to find at the bottom of your Zoom panel. But in the meantime, Yunus, in the context of political economy, where sort of big picture, where do you see the Middle East as a region or as individual countries in 15 years or in 20 years? What looks different than today and what might look similar to the situation of the world today?
Thank you. This is a very important question. Of course, it's very hard to predict the future with precision, but judging from the policies of today, we can have an idea what will look like in 20 years, 25 years, which is basically a generation from now. I would say it is safe to say that the MENA region will undergo a significant transformation in its energy sector, with a growing emphasis on renewables, alongside, of course, natural gas continuing to be play a major role in and all remaining important, but gradually declining. I mean, we should note here that in all energy transitions in the history of mankind, there has never been an all-out replacement of the former source of energy, but actually just adding one layer to the former one. So I don't expect oil and gas to be completely vanishing from the landscape. In terms of renewables, I mean, this will be driven by falling costs and more government support and environmental concern that renewable energy sources like solar and wind will become much more prominent in many parts of the MENA region and part of the energy mix. Gas also, it is quite still abundant in many of these countries that are in the GCC. So relatively clean burning and affordable natural gas is expected to remain the dominant fuel for power generation in the region for the foreseeable future. In terms of oil, it will still be present, but its importance is likely to gradually decline as many countries will diversify their energy portfolios and the world is transitioning fast towards a low carbon future. So overall, I think this region is expected to move towards a more balanced and sustainable energy mix in the coming decades. This will involve and require continued investment in other sources. This is let's say, the technical aspect of things. Let's not forget that this region is undergoing many challenges and conflicts. I think 1/3 of the countries of the regions are in conflict. Other ones that are not in conflict are not always very stable, or actually they're fragile in terms of institutional development. There is an ongoing regional Cold War happening in the region. You have also emerging crises that these countries will have to face, issues that are related to climate change and environment, water stress. I mean, we already see in certain countries in the region water shortages. This will be a major concern and problematic for the future. And for me, what will decide the future of this region for the next 2 decades or decade and a half is the serious reform and changes in terms of governance structures. Because without looking into that and really reforming structurally the institutions, making them more accountable, more inclusive, more effective, I'm not sure that most of these countries will achieve real development gains, which in turn will just exacerbate the current fragility and tensions in the region. So I wouldn't say I'm optimistic or pessimistic. For me, the future has to be prepared. So tomorrow happens today. So whatever decisions are made today will influence the future. So I don't like to think in terms of optimism or pessimism. It's what type of policies you put in place that will determine your future.
Absolutely. On that note, one policy that we haven't talked much about yet, or one trend that we haven't talked much about yet, Jessica, is storage and battery or otherwise storage in the region and how it's being used to prepare for a clean energy future. What more could be done, and sort of where you see that right now.
So that's also a key factor, a key enabler of all the ambitious renewable energy targets in the region, because we're not going to meet renewable energy targets without massive deployment of energy storage systems, because our renewable energy targets across the MENA region are very ambitious. And that's for 2 reasons. Energy storage systems are not only important to store the electricity, especially in the case of the current technologies being deployed in renewable energy in MENA countries, which are solar and wind. We normally need to have dispatchable electricity, and dispatchable electricity is electricity that's available when there's demand, when the utility needs to dispatch it. In the case of wind and solar, this is electricity that's being generated and when the source is available, not necessarily when there's a demand, there's a load for it. So we need to store this electricity, and energy storage systems do that, but energy storage systems also provide another huge benefit, and that's several services on the grid can be provided through energy storage systems. So in the past, for example, our power systems used to focus on balancing supply and demand, and that was very straightforward. You have a rising demand, you're going to add power generation capacity. But now power systems are focusing on reducing the peak demand, and that's what we call peak shaving. So we need to reduce, we don't want to have always, like, for example, this is a demand and suddenly it's summer in the MENA countries and the demand suddenly peaks in July and August to unsustainable levels. And meeting that difference requires a lot of capacity, power generation capacity, which we barely use. But we want to reduce this demand. And that comes through different demand side management, different kind of systems, but also energy storage to provide that. Another thing we can use energy storage systems for is frequency, because I've touched upon how intermittent renewable energy systems on the grid cause a frequency dysregulation, so that can regulate the frequency. A lot of other services could also be provided through energy storage systems. But here we have a challenge, and that energy storage systems are more difficult in terms of projects to have as bankable projects compared to renewable energy, because the cash flow is not as continuous and constant the way renewable energy are. So in case of renewable energy, for example, we're going to sell electricity per kilowatt hour, and we know we do the assessments, we know how much yield is going to be with a certain level, small margin of error, but we know that we're going to sell this kilowatt hour at this rate to the utility for X number of years, 25 years, for example. But in the case of energy storage systems, selling only the storage capacity, the capacity payments, doesn't make a project bankable. So we also need to add what we call stacking other revenues. And these revenues come from selling services. So we need to sell these services to the grid in addition to capacity payments for it to be to improve the revenues for developer and makes the project bankable. Sorry. And this is more developed in markets, for example, like the UK. But in the Middle East, we don't have a value, a monetized value for these services. And often these services are not identified by the utility. So it makes it a lot more complex to make these projects bankable. And so what we're doing and what we need to do a lot more often in MENA countries is to have projects that are renewable energy plus storage, or storage alone, but they would need government support. And so to afford these systems, again, we need governments, utilities that can attract financing or have the ability to finance this project. And so we're seeing the bulk of the renewable, the energy storage systems being built in GCC, mostly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but also in Morocco and to a lower extent in Jordan. This needs to be picked up, but I'm always getting back to the financing issue and the ability to attract financing.
Thank you. We will take a question from the audience next, and it kind of relates back to your mention, Jessica. So the question is to discuss Saudi Arabia's commercial nuclear power plans in the context of the region. And we've been talking a lot about renewables, and we've talked about grids, and we've talked about sort of the overall shifts in energy diversification, but we haven't talked about commercial nuclear ambitions in the region, which exist across a number of states, and Saudi Arabia is one that is sort of prominent among those. So if you could talk a little bit about that aspect.
Yeah, so there are several governments across the region who have plans to develop nuclear energy for power generation. Of course, Saudi Arabia is kind of better positioned to make this happen, and that's because there are two key challenges we're witnessing in the nuclear nuclear systems, and that's financing. They're expensive to build, and they're more costly. They actually cost the cost for the nuclear energy as planned versus what's being built has a wide difference in it. So across time, it's requiring a lot more financing than originally estimated during planning stages. And the other factor is the timeline. They're taking a lot more time to build than originally estimated. And so having deep pockets helps in building nuclear systems. I'm not going to address the safety concerns and all the certification standards that need to be met for this, because this is not within my background and expertise. But it's easier for governments to plan to build nuclear than to actually make it happen. We've seen the UAE move forward with its reactors, and I suspect that Saudi Arabia would be next. And then we have to see for the other countries across the region. But nuclear energy also does provide a base load power generation, so it's available 24/7, and so it does fit in the plans to decarbonize the power system.
Great, thank you. And I think we have time for one final question to each of you before wrapping the discussion. So I'll direct it to both of you and then let you jump in. But what I'd like to leave us with is sort of both an action-oriented and optimistic note. So I'd be curious to hear what policies or actions you see today in the Middle East that you think are the most promising, that make you the most optimistic with regard to the energy transition and overall economic diversification and low carbon future plans for the Middle East.
If I might jump in.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, just following up on what Jessica said in terms of the question on nuclear power, there's also another side of the development of nuclear power is the geopolitics at the regional level. I mean, there is, of course, Saudi Arabia has stated officially that they wanted to develop nuclear capacities, civil capacities. But this is also related to geopolitics of the region. Iran has developed this, and you have Pakistan, and I believe that more and more countries in the region, because of the geopolitics, will be interested in developing it. Whether this will shift to something that goes beyond the civilian programs, that's remains to be seen, but this is also a stress on the NPT agreement, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So this is something that to be kept in mind. In terms of promising policy that we see in the region, definitely. I mean, the example of Morocco is quite important. The number of renewable energy programs that have been developed for the last 10 years, solar energy, particularly the public companies that were established, the investment in renewable energy is quite important, and I think Morocco has set a good example for the region. And then in the oil-producing countries, we see, as I said earlier, that there is more interest in other sectors. Tourism is becoming a major investment for Saudi Arabia, which is new because that country never really invested in that field. We see a plethora of educational programs. Centers have been established for research and development. We see this as a driving force in Qatar. We see it in Abu Dhabi also. There's actually competition between these three main countries in developing new sectors: education, technology, innovation, and trying to attract, to become a hub to attract investors. So I see this as quite promising. It remains to be seen how far these policies will go. But as I said earlier, if you do not accompany these with more progressive governance policies, it will be a restraining factor.
I'd like to add that we're seeing a more political commitment towards an energy transition driven not necessarily by climate concerns, but by economic and energy security concerns and drivers. But as long as it keeps the momentum, then, and if we do not necessarily have to meet all the ambitious renewable energy targets for 2030, because we're less than 6 years into that. But if we do keep the momentum and grow this traction, then that's going to be great for the region, and that's very important in terms of job creation, also building for the future, because we're also in the region which we didn't discuss, but I'm just going to quickly address this, and it's because we have a large share of youth in the population, which is double the share of youth in other regions across the world, and this young population needs to have jobs, needs to have a future, a sustainable future. So these youth would be major drivers of innovation, entrepreneurship. We're seeing more entrepreneurship ecosystems across the region. And if this population doesn't have jobs, there could be a destabilizing factor in the future. So creating value through the energy transition is not only important for the energy systems and to diversify the economy from oil and a post-oil world, but also to create jobs in the future. And a lot of jobs will come from these low carbon energy systems, and we're seeing more and more momentum in this. And this gives me hope in the future of the region, and through creating values, not only looking at renewable energy or low carbon technologies in general as factors for the energy systems, but also as enabler for socioeconomic development in the future of the region.
Well, thank you so much for leaving us on that note, Eunice and Jessica, and thank you for all of your insights here today. I hope that our audience will join me in thanking you. And again, thank you so much for your contributions today, and for your contributions to our new edited volume, Energy Transitions in the Middle East. And I hope that you all will check out more of Jessica and Eunice's analysis on our Middle East Institute website and in future webinars.